participants. This is Stephen Doig, Director of Research at the Urban Institute for Energy and Society. Welcome everybody to yet another virtual Dartmouth Energy Collaborative lunch. The Dartmouth Energy Collaborative is co-hosted by the Urban Institute, Revers Center, Thayer, and as well as the Sustainability Office. I have the pleasure today to introduce both of our speakers, and then they're going to take things away. But again, thanks everybody for joining. We've been having great attendance. And a couple of other just housekeeping things. If you have questions during the course of the presentations, please send chats to me. Amro and maybe April will also ask you for individual chats if they have questions during the course of their presentations. But for ones that you want to have for the Q&A at the end, please send them to me and we'll get through as many of them as we can. We're running till 1:15 today, Eastern time. And then at the very end, we'll do Q&A, and then I'll give you a short and brief presentation, one page basically, on upcoming events that you might be interested in. So I think without further ado, let me do the introductions. April Salas is the director of Revers Center at Tuck Business School, where she focuses on energy issues. I think this year, and you'll correct me, April, you have 20-some Tuck Energy Fellows and more coming up for next year. And April is one of the recipients of an Irving Award for our request for proposals, and is working assiduously looking at energy dashboards to help inform communities on their energy footprint and decisions they can make to help improve the sustainability of their energy consumption. Amro Farid is professor at Thayer School of Engineering. He too has been an award recipient from the Urban Institute on his energy work, and he and I also work together on a collaboration with the Cold Regions Energy Lab, which is in Hanover. So I think without further ado, Amro's going to kick things off. We're going to hand over to April and then come back to Amro and finish things up and do the Q&A at the end of this presentation. Thanks very much, and Amro, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen, for the kind introduction. Today, we would like to be talking to you about researching with impact, and more specifically, Dartmouth's role in advancing New Hampshire's clean energy future. So one of the things that we often find as academics is that, we get into the labs, we write our papers, we might be focused on energy technologies or maybe new energy market economics or maybe new policy papers that we come up with. But, the question is, how does this make an actual impact in the end? How does it help reduce our carbon emissions or make energy more affordable for everyone? And so I hope that in today's presentation, you get a sense of how here at Dartmouth, we're making those efforts impactful and real. And one of the reasons that we are able to make these impacts is that we've had two really important pieces of legislation passed in 2019, actually just very recently in August. The first was Senate Bill 284, which is about New Hampshire's multi-use energy data platform. And what this does is that it's an energy data platform that allows utilities, community power aggregators, we're going to talk quite a bit about that, customers and other New Hampshire energy stakeholders, and really there's quite a few of them, share energy consumption, generation and system data in hopefully near real time. This is a big feat, and it's really important because when you really think about it, pretty much any dynamic and competitive market that you think about is really driven by data. The more access you have to data, the more there is a potential to reduce costs, and in the case of energy, also adopt clean renewables and hopefully inspire all sorts of different innovation. The other bill that followed right on the heels of the first is for community choice aggregators. of electric power. And what these do is that they allow local communities to become the default provider of retail electric power products and services. So you're not formally buying electric power from the utility per se, but you're actually might be buying it from the city of Lebanon or the town of Hanover or some other community choice aggregator. And that's important because these aggregators are now empowered to provide a wide variety of electric power products and services, depending upon the preferences of that particular municipality. So it might be driven by cost, but you might be really interested in, a clean energy tariff, or maybe there are going to be services that are tuned to your particular usage pattern. And one of those things can include transactive energy market mechanisms that in our lab we've been working on for quite some time. We'll get back to that towards the end of the presentation. So what I'd like to do now is maybe stop sharing my screen and hand over to April, and she'll tell you a bit more about both of these directions that New Hampshire has been taking.
Great, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stephen and Amro. Both have been incredible partners, and we're really excited that we've been awarded the grant in order to be able to think more deeply about these needs. So I'm going to go ahead and advance the slides. So again, we are talking about these three sort of major buckets, but I'm going to step through the first two and then hand it back over to Amro, who's going to talk about the 19-197 data docket as well as his work in Lebanon. So to get started, I think it's really helpful to contextualize that we are in a really high-priced electric retail rate environment. It's the sixth most expensive in the U.S., and that is including Alaska and Hawaii. If we were to exclude those two states, we'd be the fourth most expensive. So when you think about alternatives to default, it's always helpful to have this cost basis in mind. New Hampshire was one of the first states to deregulate in 1997 in the country, and the whole point of deregulation was to remove the monopoly of the utility and to bring competition into the electricity supply business so that prices would fall as a result. So now, sort of 20 plus years out of deregulation, the results in New Hampshire have been a bit of a mixed bag. Large industrial and commercial customers in the state have benefited. The majority of those are on some form of third-party supply where they're able to impact their rates. But for the individual ratepayer, we can now, under deregulation, choose where to buy the electricity from. But as the chart shows, it hasn't necessarily brought down residential electricity prices. I'm going to get into a little bit of why and sort of where we are today and the importance of that regulatory change that Amro just mentioned. But it's also important to note on the right is the Climate Action Plan. As you'll see, it's dated from 2009, so it's over 11 years old. And one of the major constraining factors for development of climate action in New Hampshire is that this report was derived before a lot of the cost curves have come down on renewable energy. ISO New England also shows renewable generation capacity is outpacing planned conventional generation plans for electric power in New England, and the New Hampshire report focuses much more on cost as opposed to carbon reduction. So I think one of the problems is it misaligns incentives for our energy efficiency programs and the PUC regulatory proceedings that it really have to take cost reduction basis in mind when moving forward with certain programs. So this is something that we see is in sore need of an update. And further contextualizing it, we have been working within our communities for years to advance competitive energy supply, consumer choice, affordable prices, and resilience. This is just Hanover's pathway, kind of a pre and a sort of where are we headed. But you'll see Hanover is one of the only communities in the state that is actually a registered NEPOOL member and benefits from wholesale electric power prices. But it's just for the municipal electric load. So, while we are able to adopt this deregulation in the mid-90s and allow for decoupling of generation, transmission, and distribution, and allow for that competitive energy supply and consumer choice, it's really been a struggle for communities to adopt it. Communities have been across New Hampshire have been pursuing alternatives to default electricity programs for some time. and it's really the ratepayers that are driving the transition. I think you guys have seen me brief this slide before. In the center is Judy Kalla, who was a very vocal volunteer who led the effort for our sort of groundswell support, which is the picture above her at town meeting day in 2017. Hanover held a community-wide referendum resulting in overwhelming support for green power. We're the first in the country to do so by popular vote, and as it turns out, we actually weren't the only community in search of this. 5 New Hampshire communities have since followed suit, and Keene just recently joined as the 104th city in the U.S., so that to have a 100% renewable energy commitment. While we endorse this goal, dozens of other New Hampshire cities and towns have equally aggressive decarbonization goals. As members of the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, it's a peer-to-peer network of local governments and sustainability professionals. That also connects Hanover and the likes of these other communities to more than 200 member cities and counties across the U.S. and Canada, representing over 87 million residents. So the importance of this public vote was the community-wide referendum. Obviously, it was in the 3 operational categories we've talked about for some time. But one of the things that's really, really important is that it really takes a no one-size-fits-all approach. So we really needed to develop different strategies for residential, small business, large business, institutional, and the municipal. So kind of coming back to center, our Ready for 100 campaign generated the need for us to baseline our community's energy usage in order to figure out how to reach 100. As you'll see, it really, I would almost say getting to the vote on the commitment, this endorsement of this really sort of laudable, aggressive approach, we didn't have a specific pathway in mind. But it became very clear that we needed to focus on, green electricity first because it's the 2030 goal, and that step 1 was really focusing on, well, what do we use in the first place? How do we think about baselining that data? We're lucky. We're served, the vast preponderance of the electric supply in Hanover is served by one investor-owned utility, which should have made the effort of collecting data that much more straightforward. Little did we know that just wasn't the case. It was difficult, timely, costly. It took a staff of 4. It took a consultant, and it took explicit consent by 6 of our major electricity users in the town. This was a 6-month effort just to obtain initial electricity data, which, by the way, we didn't need any sort of regulatory change to be able to access. This is what was already allowable. We were in search of community-wide electricity consumption, something that would seem very obvious, a breakdown by customer class. We were really interested in looking at, all of our G1 accounts, which is the large users, and we were looking for aggregated totals for that usage information. What was received was quite the opposite. It was inconsistent. The data was unstructured. We found that residential and small business data was not readily accessible. The metering infrastructure was insufficient. The billing and sort of data management side on the utilities end was really not comparable, not conducive to exporting this information in a way that was useful to us. And it really hindered our ability to replicate this effort. So, we've spent $14,000 of this consultant's time out of a $40,000 energy plan that could have been spent on leading a green energy program for our residents. And at the end of the day, what we had was something that was not replicable, and and we really had to spend a lot of time actually cleaning it up and ensuring the accuracy. So why focus on data? I think that seems like an obvious answer, but I want to step you through it. Because communities really need access to this high-quality data to baseline, set goals, and measure progress. This seems intuitive, but in reality, as Hanover steps through these initiatives, what we saw is that we really can't go out for third-party supply when we don't have a sense of what our total community load was. We don't have a sense of who would have the likelihood or ability to transition from the default service to the third-party supplier in that sort of green power program. It also helped us to figure out how we needed to develop a portfolio strategy to motivate different actions within different user classes. I'll talk a little about that later. We also wanted to be able to measure effectiveness of some of our energy efficiency programs, weatherization, solarized program. We just concluded Solarized 2.0. We also realized that if we were ever to pursue municipal aggregation, we were going to need data to bid procurement of green power in order to be able to move towards municipal aggregation. This would require us to define the total community load, the customer type, and load curves. Unfortunately, at the time when we were going through this, which was just shy of when Sununu updated these SB 284 and 286, we were really behind the times. We were looking across the transom in Vermont to see all of the community and individual meter level data that was available to them. Why is that important? Because it enables Vermont to track progress, communicate priorities, because they had an energy dashboard. As you can see, not only are they able to measure their renewable energy across different end user classes, but they're also able to measure climate as well as equity and emissions profiles relative to those. So as we're looking at Hanover and getting into more of the specifics of how we were able to undertake this, data has been helping us to drive informed decisions, ultimately that all communities across the state are in search of. It saves time, saves money, ultimately allows us to develop a portfolio of customized solutions for the user classes. As you can see, there's no one-size-fits-all. Access to the simple data has enabled us to create these easy opportunities and programs that enable user groups to exercise consumer choice. We were, with the access to the higher fidelity data, it's been essential to our ability to define our climate mitigation strategy. As you can see, residential and municipal load are nearly 20% of the load. So at face value, we would have thought maybe we're not going to place as much emphasis on a residential program because it's probably a meaningless portion of our overall community's load. And what this actually told us was that small commercial and residential don't have access to some programs, and the municipality can use its leverage to create certain programs to help drive change. So how do we provide access to clean energy options that they wouldn't otherwise have? As such, we've also been able to determine our community's electricity usage over time has been in decline. Over the last 5 years, it's declined about 8%. It also helped to drive updates to our zoning and zoning ordinances, including modification to allow ground-mounted solar and residential properties, as well as to exempt solar from tax assessments. So we can see where policies are also driving change and where more action is needed. Hanover's largest independent electricity consumers generate the least renewable energy on site, so incentivizing large and small commercial on-site solar installations and other procurement opportunities could enable a significant renewable capacity increase. The legalization of municipal aggregation opens up significant opportunity for the town to procure renewable electricity on behalf of its community. And the residential and small commercial entities currently have the most limited access to renewable energy procurement strategies, as I just mentioned, and they need the most support and attention in preparation for our 2030 goals. You can also see the impact of our policies and campaigns and what their actual impact is on renewable energy adoption. We've also been able to determine that our average residential solar system size has increased to 8 kilowatts on average. We also know that panels are increasing in efficiency, with standard panels somewhere now between 300 and 350 watt panels. So all of this is giving us more information about the overall picture for Hanover. I'll be wrapping up just shortly. So data has enabled us to pursue renewable projects for certain customer classes in an informed, cost-effective way. Towards the end of this year, we should be nearing 100% solar for the municipal load. You can see our town manager, Julia Griffin, pointing to solar that's been installed on Hanover's town hall roof, which you can't see from the street. Our water reclamation facility, there's some Dartmouth facilities in that picture. And then the picture to the right is a ground-mounted solar array that's being planned for installation on town property this upcoming summer. So with this data, we've also been able to develop that specific portfolio strategy, which is going to bring me back to the municipal aggregation. While on-site solar is always preferred, and the town currently hosts over 134 residential solar systems, as I mentioned, that 700 kilowatt array that's planned in the planning stages off of Grassy Road. We've also are launching this afternoon access to a community solar project that's being developed in Liberty Service Territory, and that's also in addition to other sites that we've analyzed for effectiveness, to be able to move forward with certain ground-mounted solar or roof-mounted solar around the town. So as you'll see in this sort of heat map, there's yellow up and down the municipal aggregation sort of bucket. In our estimation, once these policies, SB 284 and 286, were enacted and updated, we always had in our mind that because we had experience buying as an e-pool member in the wholesale markets and saving the town money on electric rates, the one sort of linchpin in municipal aggregation was that there was a provision around opt-in versus opt-out, and I'll explain that in just a little bit. So once these regulations changed in late last year, one of the fundamental principles that made this yellow instead of green for us was that we weren't able to default our ratepayers into the program. But with that change, we saw, and the experience of actually trying to develop our own green power purchasing program based on our experience running 2 other programs in previous years, we wanted to move forward with some sort of green buying alternative to the utilities default. So what we see is that, municipal aggregation would provide a community ratepayers access to a program they wouldn't have access to otherwise. But what we found is that this is something that we can, take advantage of scale and do statewide. And that's where the work that Amro and I and others on this call have actually been proactively working on. Community power in New Hampshire would strengthen community choice, local control, cost efficiencies, and enable local renewables, which is the goal. So those are changing the future of clean energy in New Hampshire, and communities are really leading the charge. I've already talked about these, so I don't want to go too much into it, but really what used to be a bottom-up approach to data collection is now a conversation that Amro will go into with 19-197 around a top-down approach as well. How do we also work with the utilities to be able to structure and provide access to the data collection, the data availability, as opposed to us having to do it solely as communities from the bottom up. And then secondly, that opt-out provision that unlocks municipal aggregation or community choice. So one of the ways that we were going to undertake this with the grant that I have from the Irving Institute is to lead the development of a transition from the Vermont Energy Dash towards more of a platform as a service community energy data pilot with 5 communities across the 4 electric utilities. Now that some of these measures have been updated and changed, I'll talk about sort of where we are today, and then I'll turn it over to Amro. But one thing that I wanted to emphasize is in our due diligence, we looked at CCAs across the country, and it was really important. This opt-out provision was really critical to unlocking consumer choice programs. So where we are today, we're in the process of creating a joint action agency called Community Power New Hampshire. RSA 53E relative to aggregation of electric customers by municipalities and counties was what was updated by the passage in 2019 by Senate Bill 286. So this community power law is what enables governments to be able to procure on behalf of their residents and businesses to provide those electric services. Where we are today is that, sorry, hold on one second. So Hanover, like I said, had been in the process of launching its green power program when this update occurred. And this signaled a market shift in a number of experts pursuing collaborations and partnerships in New Hampshire. And as a means of organizing our work and eliminating redundancy, we reached out to Clean Energy New Hampshire to discuss alignment of all communities in New Hampshire who wanted to pursue community choice. That's when it became abundantly clear that we were not the only community who wanted this goal. And as you can see, where we are today is discussion around a joint action agency that would enjoy shared sort of back office services There's a coalition of local governments and volunteer experts who are helping us to determine sort of where we start with all of this. We've been in months of conversation around what that community coalition would look like, as well as sort of how we would self-organize internally as we begin to move towards launching this. So you can see the town of Bristol, Harrisville, Hanover, the city of Lebanon, city of Nashua, and Cheshire County are among those in the community coalition, and supporting partners including the Monadnock Sustainability Hub, Dr. Amro Farid, Sam Golding from Community Choice Partners, Clean Energy New Hampshire's Henry Herndon, who's the Director of Local Energy Solutions, as well as the Rockingham Planning Commission. So the objectives are such as on the right, and I'll be wrapping up just a second, Amro, is really in working together and how we form these shared services. So we effectively are able to launch our own community power programs, but actually benefit from that shared back office and CP&H. So looking at some of the goals, it's around wholesale and retail market competition. How do we reduce costs, improve efficiency, think about providing access in the retail electricity markets to green power options. And as we're already looking forward to what that local level sort of process is to move things forward. So for example, Hanover has formed its electric aggregation committee. We're in the process of drafting the aggregation plan, and then we would be preparing for town meeting in 2021 to get the legislative approval from town meeting. And then that's when we would effectively have a community power program launched. So where we are, and this is my last slide before I'll turn it back to Amro, in the development of the community energy dashboard, it's in the works. We have the 19-197 data docket and the establishment of a statewide energy data platform, but it doesn't contemplate necessarily who, where, or where, and that's some of the efforts that we'll walk you through. But in the meantime, communities need to push forward with these efforts. So how do we replicate data transfers from investor-owned utilities to the community, provide technical assistance in cleaning up and analyzing the data, and assist communities in developing know-how to consider portfolio strategies to their clean energy goals. So where we will end up is developing the Community Energy Data Fellows Program within Dartmouth. We're in the process of bringing on our coordinator for that program, and we'll be launching hopefully this summer or early this fall to be able to work with communities across the state, much like the process we undertook with Liberty on how to make those data requests, collection, validate, and essentially structure it in the lead up to the development of a statewide energy dashboard. So that was a lot of information. With that, I will pause and turn it back over to you, Amro.
Thanks very much, April.
Thank you, April. So I'm going to share my screen now. So is everything visible, Stephen, for my slides here?
Yeah,
so I'll continue to talk about how we're architecting New Hampshire's multi-use energy data platform. This is part of New Hampshire PUC's data docket 19-197. And then once I've gone through that, I'll talk about our LabTech project that's funded by the Irving Institute. And really, we're going to continue this theme about how academia can forge meaningful partnerships with local communities to bring about impactful and sustainable change in our energy system. So we have to first start thinking about how we might envision a New Hampshire energy data platform. What might it look like? So, I've drawn a big box that looks like a platform, and naturally we're going to have a whole bunch of different energy stakeholders sitting or playing on top of that platform. And naturally, they might include consumers and prosumers and electric distribution companies, whether they're transmission or distribution owners. But you can think a little bit more carefully. You soon recognize that there are a lot of other different types of energy stakeholders. And I don't think that this figure is at all exhaustive, but it does capture a good number. So community power aggregators or electricity suppliers, of course, municipalities, maybe the PUC itself, the Office of the Consumer Advocate. You can imagine other government offices at the local or at the state level, or maybe even independent system operators are going to be interested in the data that resides here. And all of them are going to have their respective roles to play in terms of providing data, but also maybe seeking out data. So I'm going to ask a question to all of you. We've been going on for about 45 minutes now, and I'd like to see how many of us are still alive and well. So let me ask, how might we think about building such an energy data platform? And what are we going to have to pay special attention to along the way? So please do open up your chat boxes and provide your answers. In the meantime, I'm going to suggest a couple of ideas. You know, for the technically minded of us, why not just start coding right away? Let's get started. And another idea might be, let's write a request for proposals, because I'm honestly not so technically minded, and outsource it to the lowest bidder. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds to write in the chat box your responses.
Yeah, and folks should send their answers directly to Amro so they all flow to him, or your thoughts.
Okay, so let's take a look at what some people have said here. So there are a couple of comments. We have to think about a taxonomy. I suspect that's a taxonomy of data that we're going to be interested in. A couple of other comments around a data model as well. A data model is certainly going to be an important part of this data platform. One comment is on who's going to own the data, and I think that is going to be a big question that we'll get to towards the end about the governance of this this data platform. I'll give you my thoughts on how we might proceed in such a honestly really big endeavor. So I think the first place is to recognize is that it's really all about people and stakeholders. And in the New Hampshire data docket, we find that there are actually 20 different interveners or stakeholders that are actively participating in making this data docket go forward. And you can see that there are a wide variety of different types of stakeholders, whether they're at the state level and are effectively part of our government, or at the local level, our utilities. April and I, representing Dartmouth from the Thayer and Tuck School, a good number of different small businesses, whether they are consulting or non-for-profit agencies, or maybe even technology vendors. So all of these have some role to play, and quite frankly, I would say that all of them have some meaningful contribution that they can bring to the successful deployment of this data platform. So I suspect that there are a number of different steps that we're going to have to take, and probably the first one is context awareness. In my model-based systems engineering class, we talk a lot about the context. That's everything outside of the system that we're trying to build. We have to be aware of the legal context, and we've talked about SB 284 and 286. And then we can start thinking about, well, what does the state data platform have to do for us? And that in systems engineering is all about requirements gathering. So we would have to identify the different requirements, and sometimes we also might call them use cases, the way different stakeholders might interact with this data platform, and collect them from all the different stakeholders. So, you know, what might these things look like? Well, I've given a couple of examples here. So maybe the first one is that all the stakeholders have to have access to the data. And naturally, that access needs to be appropriate to each stakeholder because, you know, what one consumer sees is probably appropriate to them and another consumer is appropriate to the other. But also an independent system operator or a utility or a community power aggregator, all of them are going to have their respective roles, and access to the data needs to be secure and interoperable. So this is a good example of one requirement that you might bring to bear in the development of the data platform. Another is that a lot of requirements actually come from the law, right? So, you know, we've been talking about SB 286 for community power aggregators, brand new law. It ended up appearing as part of RSA 53-E. And one of the provisions that it has, and verbatim, CPAs have the authority to provide for the supply of electric power, demand side management, conservation, amongst a number of other different types of services on a opt-out basis. Well, if we're going to be very careful about adhering to the laws that have been passed in this state of New Hampshire, then we're going to have to make sure that the data platform helps implement those laws as a technological artifact. So here, what we've done is that there are 7 provisions on the left-hand side. There are 7 different requirements on the right-hand side, and that will help us make sure that the data platform helps us get to where we want to go from a legal perspective. So you're going to gather all of these different requirements from all the different stakeholders that are intervening into this this process, and really, what you need to start recognizing is that everybody will have done so entirely independently. And, you know, there might be some overlap in what they have said. Maybe the language is different, but they're actually talking about the same giraffe. And what we need to do is start to reconcile all of this information in a lot of into one consistent set, so that ultimately it can get built in one day. And you know, in systems engineering, we call this a mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive set of requirements. And what we also need to do is try to make sure that those requirements move more and more into something that is implementable from a technical perspective. So what do we mean by technical requirements? And here I'll make hopefully a lighthearted joke in that in our home, my wife in the winter might say, well, we need to make the house nice, warm, and cozy. And if I had my hardcore engineering hat on, I might say that doesn't compute. Maybe please specify the temperature in Fahrenheit or the relative humidity in percentage. And the more accurate you are with the requirements, then the more likely that the actual requirements will be implemented correctly by the engineering vendors that end up building this thing. The other thing that you must recognize is that as we pull all these requirements together, is that, you know, the various stakeholders all have equally valid perspectives on what these requirements are. You really want to bring them into a superset rather than saying one stakeholder's requirements are more valid than another. And when we think about data platforms, it's kind of abstract for many of us, but think about a road. If we wanted to build a road maybe in the city of Lebanon, we would say, well, it needs to have some lanes for motorists, some lanes for a lane for cyclists, and maybe a sidewalk for pedestrians, because all 3 of those different types of city residents and stakeholders have something to say. And, you know, my driving down the road should not preclude someone who is biking to work from to getting to their workplace. So some important themes in what is a requirements engineering process. So as you start going through this process, what you're going to find is that there is just so much information that you're going to have to start hanging all of these different requirements into well-formed and unifying frameworks. And here I've suggested one way of doing so based upon what would be called a life cycle stage. So we might think about, one use case that enables transactive energy markets, or another that, I want to improve the energy efficiency of my home, and think about like data that I might get from something like a Sense Energy Monitor. Or I might have a really expensive large motor, maybe for a large consumer, and I want to track its power quality and get notifications that it might be behaving in ways that are inefficient. And naturally, this data should also help our local and state governments help reach compliance. One of the Office of Consumer Advocates use cases is supporting the New Hampshire PUC's 900 net metering rules. That does sound like an onerous process with regards to compliance, but it can be facilitated with the access to data. And as you move towards technical requirements, you must recognize that systems engineers think about a taxonomy of requirements in a fairly systematic way. I've drawn this from one of the engineering design or systems engineering textbooks of all the different types of requirements you might run into. Once you have actually unified all of your requirements, you can start actually thinking about the associated benefits. And in systems engineering, what we often say is that system function, all of these different requirements, when they come together, effectively describe the system function, drives benefits. And one way to think about this is that, if you're building a home, you might say, well, I have a plot of land, it's in such and such a town, and maybe it might be 2 acres, 3 bedrooms, it's gonna have a living room, dining room, 2 baths, so forth, so on. And if you went to a realtor or an appraiser and gave them those sorts of functions that you find that you are contemplating in your house, they could probably give you a pretty good ballpark of what that future home is worth. You can get a sense of what the benefits or the value is to you. And so from there, we might think about, as we come back to our data platform, what is the relevant data that we might think about that apply to these various requirements that we have identified. And I have to emphasize that if you really want to do this right, you really don't want to do it in a willy-nilly fashion, right? Yeah, sure, I want to measure maybe kilowatts or maybe VARs or timestamp it with certain temporality, but there are a wide number of standards that have been provided by the IEC to help you support these data-intensive activities. So you would draw from the standards as much as possible in the determination of these data fields and categories. And that gets you to a point where now you can begin to say, well, what are the associated costs? And again, now you're really talking about system form, and that drives costs. Coming back to our hypothetical home, if you go to a builder and you ask him what's it going to cost, well, he's going to say, well, how many 2x4s do you have? How many panels of drywood? How much plywood are you going to need for the floorboards and so forth? It's the form, these actual elements of what the system is made up of that drives the costs of the data platform's implementation in the end. And then that brings us to a really important question to sort of round off this discussion of data platforms, which is really about the governance and implementation challenges. So I'm going to ask you to come back to your chat, and I'll ask you, what do you think might be some important governance and implementation challenges? And I'll again give you about 30 seconds to write your answers in. One answer is, we got this. What could possibly go wrong?
We're waiting for the chats. This is Steve. It's 1 o'clock now. It'd be nice to have 5 minutes for Q&A at the end. Will that timing work for you?
Yeah, I just have a couple more slides.
Cool.
So I've gotten quite a few answers here already, and some great ones at that. So who is going to own the data? Who's going to own the data platform? Who's going to operate the data platform? And these are indeed all really relevant questions that are still very much quite open, and I'll leave us to think about what is the most appropriate answer for that. And I think ultimately it comes down to an approach that is democratic and in line with our values and collective values as a state. So I'll transition over to a project that we've been doing with the Irving Institute, our Lebanon Blockchain Transactive Energy Control project. And I'm working on this project with my graduate student, Steffi Mohanji. A big thanks to her for preparing these slides. And so in our conventional model of electric power that everyone's fairly familiar with, as a consumer, you're going to buy electricity from your utility. But if we think about a transactive energy model that is now tied to a municipal aggregator, the consumer is now buying power from the municipal aggregator, but the municipal aggregator might be buying some of their power from the distribution utility, but also from wholesale markets and potentially other competitive suppliers. And now they can provide, the municipal aggregator that is, can provide all sorts of different electricity products and services, maybe even ones based upon real-time pricing. And the idea here is to enable customer choice, access cleaner, cheaper electricity, and allow for potentially peer-to-peer electricity trading, so that here, as I am in the middle of the day using all of my electronics, my neighbor's solar PV panels can actually serve me directly, and I might want to buy from my neighbor rather than buying from electrons generated very far away. So we've been working within the lines, the Laboratory for Intelligent Integrated Networks of Engineering Systems, to develop the optimization algorithms that will enable these markets to actually occur. Now, we're not the only ones to be doing this. There is a company called Power Ledger and another called LO3 Energy, amongst others. But really what we want to do as we develop these algorithms is bring about much stronger guarantees of convergence, but also guarantees of physical security as well, and of course, economic optimality. And our knowledge of renewable energy integration really gives us an advantage to making sure that these markets are not only supporting efficient economic operation, but also reliable grids, and also helping bring about greater sustainability as well. And so here is a GIS map that Steffi has kindly produced of the feeders that are in the city of Lebanon. We are very grateful for our partnership with the city of Lebanon. Also, Liberty Utilities has been instrumental in giving us the data. It took a good number of iterations to get it to this point. And we're finalizing the data, combining the software model with that data and running simulations. And we're looking forward to producing some really insightful, cutting edge and very practical research on that basis. So thank you very much for your attention. It's been an honor to present also with April here about researching with impact to enable New Hampshire's clean energy future. We're certainly, both of us, open for questions.
That's great. Thanks so much, Amro, and thanks so much, April. I have a set of questions that's come through to me on the chat, but other folks certainly feel free to send me some more. And if we have time, we've got about 10 minutes now. We'll dive right into the questions. I'm going to start with one for you, April, in just a moment. But what I wanted to summarize for the entire audience, you can see, is a really nice sort of collaborative partnership here with April and Amro, really tackling different parts of the same challenge. You know, April very focused more on the community side and how to make this happen. And Amro sort of saying, well, you also need to have the engineering behind it in order to actually move to a distributed energy system that accounts for real physical things that have to happen. And at the same time, April's really been sort of thinking about and working with real stakeholders who have to come to agreement on these kinds of things. So it's a really nice sweep of the arc of the across what I would call the power system here in New Hampshire. One thing I want to start with you, April. One of the questions that came through is one of the motivating forces at the beginning of your talk was around the cost of energy and how it's pretty darn high here in New Hampshire compared to most other states in the nation. And do you have some thoughts or early inklings of what the efforts that you're doing and Amro are doing and others could do to energy prices? Is it more a matter of holding them flat? Is it going to push them up because we're actually going to have to pay more for renewable energy and energy efficiency? Or is it something that might actually lead to a decline in electricity prices? I know that's a lot to ask and you'll have to get out your Ouija board, but is there any thoughts on that part of the equation?
Yeah, I can take it first, and Amro, I'll turn it over to you. Our hope is that in the short term, we have an expectation that it may have a slight increase, result in a slight increase for sort of the average consumer, especially within our community. But what we are looking at in our assessments and the PPAs that we are undertaking with some of the project developers, especially for the larger scale systems, is that it will stabilize or decrease prices over the long haul. And so that's the primary objective, is that while we are sort of a well-off community, if you will, we don't want to pay a premium for renewables forever. So this is one way to sort of make the system more efficient, while also we know the ISO is also increasing the amount of large-scale, utility-scale renewables into the entire ISO New England grid. But we see an opportunity to enhance that behind the meter and then locally in front of the meter.
Great, thanks a lot, April. Amro, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, so, you know, from our experience with working on the ISO New England Renewable Energy Integration Study in the medium to long term, which is really my concern as an academic, 2025, 2030 and beyond, we see that renewable energy actually helps serve to bring down energy costs. And we can expect that to happen. And the more responsive our retail electricity markets are, the more likely that that's going to accelerate. So good examples, again, if you are able to move your demand around so that you're taking advantage of maybe solar in the middle of the day, then you're going to find that your rates are going to be a lot lower. In the more near term, what a lot of this data can help you to do is to recognize when you have coincident peaks, which is actually a very important part of our electricity rates right now. So the peak consumption on a monthly basis or the peak consumption on a yearly basis, if you know when that is, or you can predict it accurately, and make sure that you're not consuming during those times, as what the city of Lebanon has been doing, then you can bring down your rates quite a bit. So it's all about, in my mind, laying the right infrastructure and information so that you can make informed decisions, and this will bring down system costs for everybody.
And Amro, thanks for that, and April as well. And I think another question that builds on that, we'll start with you, Amro, is that where and how does demand flexibility fit into this picture because if we can fold load under the solar envelope when solar energy is cheap and store it for later use, that could bring down costs. And there's obviously a technical component to that. How do you shift demand? And then I think, April, from your perspective, is also a community involvement, community education, and customer education component to this, that people understand that cost of electricity shift during the day. So, Amro, what are your thoughts about load flexibility and shifting load?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of load flexibility, shifting load, curtailing load, all of these different types of demand-related services. They really require three things to make them work. One, you need to have a fairly detailed understanding of your own load on a temporal basis. So maybe data every minute or so, and certainly the data platform can help in that regard. Second, you need to have retail rates that are enable real-time pricing, and I suspect that these community power aggregators will work very hard to develop those types of market mechanisms. And then thirdly, you know, none of us are going to be sitting around by the proverbial light switch just so that we can save a few you know, kilowatt hours here or there, or even just, you know, watt hours here or there. So it really needs to be done in an automated fashion. And so this is where you need to have the energy Internet of Things devices that are network enabled, that are going to respond to these price signals, and actually bring about the flexibility in a very automated way. So those three things are necessary to come together.
Thanks, Amro. April, do you want to add anything to that, just from the community perspective, and any discussions that may have happened about the value of flexibility?
Yeah, I think we greatly value it, and we really support the work that Amro and the lab are doing, and especially in partnership with Lebanon, to have a proof of concept that something like this can work and can be applicable to the New Hampshire context. With that said, I think the advantage of forming Community Power New Hampshire is such that communities can choose how they implement it. One frustration we have is the quality of the metering infrastructure in the state is sorely insufficient and inadequate, and specifically within Liberty Service territory, to enable consumers, retail consumers, more understanding of how they use electricity, when they use it, what they use. I mean, we sort of have a one-off meter reading once a month where a truck drives around. And so we feel like there's a lot of space between where we are and where Amro and the lab can envision for a Transactive platform. Hanover isn't necessarily looking to take that first step, you know, more immediately, but I think we feel like there's a lot that can be gained with higher data fidelity and access to a better understanding of who's using what, so that we can better customize that strategy of service offerings.
That's great. And I might just add, for the audience in general, there was a study done by Rocky Mountain Institute probably 5 years ago now, called The Economics of Load Flexibility, and they modeled a utility customer, a residential customer in Hawaii, which admittedly has a good solar resource, but they were able to show that something like 80% of a household's load could be put under the solar envelope, so from morning till night, and using things like hot water storage or pre-cooling and things like that. So I think there's, you know, at least some documented modeling that's been done, and I'm sure Amro's done something similar, that indicates that it could allow people to not worry too much about net metering and that economics of their own residential solar system, but to actually just meet their own demand in a timely way. Well, that brings us to the close of the hour, basically. I want to leave a moment here for Stephanie to push a slide onto the screen. So if you could stop sharing, Amro, that would be great. And then I guess so this is some upcoming events, just so people know it. There's Sparks discussion with Amy Barnes Then on Friday, the 22nd, we're going to have a Jones seminar. Next week, also busy with another Abby Hopper, who is also on our advisory board. And then finally, Laura Paulin's going to talk next week about the nexus of energy and health. So I just want to thank the speakers again. Can't give a round of applause other than like this these days. But Amro and April, thank you so much for presenting to research. Obviously very topical and relevant for those of us who live here in the Granite State. And it's great that we can continue the seminar series even if we can't meet each other in person at this point in time. So thanks so much for everybody's time and attention. Really appreciate it. And stay tuned for the next set of series. Keep an eye on our website. There'll be more talks coming up other than the ones that are on the screen today. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dave.